Hi, everyone. This is America Adapts, the climate change podcast. Hey, Adapters. Welcome back to another exciting episode. Returning to the podcast is Mark Nevitt. Mark is an associate professor of law at Emory University School of Law in Atlanta, Georgia. We discuss his new paper that's under review entitled Destroy, Rebuild, Repeat: How to Break the Climate Disaster Cycle. As you can imagine, it's an ambitious attempt to understand how the legal system will need to reform as we all adapt to the impacts of climate change. Mark gives some very specific advice on how we can help with managed retreat and how government will need to rethink land use policies. We discuss things like halting government services, democratizing climate information, and his framework on how to break this climate disaster cycle. Yes, very controversial subject, but Mark offers some pathways on how to understand these issues better. Before we get started, just a preview of some upcoming episodes. I went to the Waterfront Conference in New York City, hosted by the Waterfront Alliance. Some very cool work going on in that region. And across the Bay, I'll also have an episode on the New Jersey Coastal Resilience Conference. And I recently went to Honolulu, Hawaii to cover 2 workshops hosted by the Department of Defense. It was my first time in Hawaii, and yes, it was incredible. And I'll have an episode out highlighting those 2 workshops. And Dr. Carolyn Kuski from the Environmental Defense Fund will return to the podcast to talk insurance markets and Florida, 2 of my favorite topics. Great stuff on the way, and stick around to get my hot take for this episode. Okay, let's jump into this conversation with Mark Nevitt. Hey, Adapters, welcome back to a very exciting episode. Joining me is Mark Nevitt. Mark is an associate professor of law at Emory University School of Law in Atlanta, Georgia. Hi, Mark. Welcome back to the podcast.
Hi, Doug. Great to be back.
And I just want to acknowledge right off the bat, the timing is just perfect. You have some really positive news that happened in the last week. Can you tell us what that is?
Yes, the Emory University Board of Trustees just voted me through to grant me tenure. So thanks for mentioning that, Doug.
Congratulations. I know that's incredibly big deal. And is this your first podcast since you become a tenure professor? I just want to know if that's the case.
It is. And I think the podcast from last year that we did, Doug, was part of my tenure file. So thank you, Doug, for helping me get across the finish line.
All right. Okay. I hope so. I just want to let people know that you were on an episode previously, because a lot of times they're coming into this in the last 6 months. And so I always encourage people, go back into the archive. I did a great episode with Mark. I love talking about law and adaptation. And I think we really dug into that. So definitely go back and check into that. But we're going to be digging into some new work that you've done related to what we did in that past episode. But again, for those people who don't know who you are, can you just ground them in what kind of environmental law, what you do there at Emory?
Sure, absolutely. So I'm a former naval officer. I flew Navy jets and was a JAG. So I joke around in gallows humor that I have a very high carbon footprint from my time flying Navy jets off aircraft carriers. And I'm an associate professor of law at Emory. And I teach climate change law and policy. I teach a natural resources law class. I teach an environmental law class. And a lot of my research is increasingly look at the security implications and the disaster implications of climate change.
In our last conversation, we did talk about some of the courses that you teach. And I think there's specifically a climate change and the law course. And correct me if I'm wrong. And if that's the case, are there additional courses that have come online? How's it looking at Emory? Are they expanding their climate change portfolio?
They are. And we have this incredible Emory Climate Research Initiative, which is really novel interdisciplinary research initiative, Doug. Across the campus, we have a medical school, we got a public health school, we got a law school, arts and sciences, Canlis School of Theology. Everyone's involved on basically climate research, hosting events, doing scholarship. It's really incredible. And within Emory Law School, we have a famous clinic, the Turner, named after Ted Turner Environmental Law Clinic, where students get into the practical implications of environmental justice and climate justice in the city of Atlanta. And we just have a wide swath of courses offered at Emory Law. It's a great place to study climate change law and environmental law in the city of Atlanta. And the interest from students is through the roof. So I have the best students in the world. I'm lucky to have them, and they are fired up with great ideas.
That's fantastic. And you know what? Before I forget, you had mentioned you flew these jets and you actually described that experience on that previous episode. Another reason for you guys to go back in the archive. It's really very cool. Let's pivot here. And so we did talk about this previous article that you wrote, and the title of it is The Legal Crisis Within the Climate Crisis. And so we talked a bit about that, and we actually talked about it a little bit before it even was published. And so I want you to ground my listeners, because the majority of the conversation we're going to have today is of this new article, but I think it's important. It's almost like a sister publication. It's leading into the next one. Can you give us an overview of what you were doing in that article?
Sure, Doug. And the timing for this podcast is great because that was just officially published in the Stanford Law Review. And my central argument in that article is that just as we have a climate crisis, and most of your listeners are aware of that, we also have legal doctrines, statutes that have not really kept up with our climate destabilized future. I call it, these doctrines were designed for an Earth 1.0, but we're in an Earth 2.0, which is defined increasingly by physical destabilization. So there are 4 or so adaptation strategies that are at its core. Each one of those adaptation strategies has legal challenges and policy challenges. And I'm happy to walk you through briefly what those are before we get into my new article.
Yeah, let's do that. Let's just talk about those, because I think it'll be a nice grounding for some of the conversation that we're going to have in the new article.
Sure, absolutely. So the first strategy is just the resistance strategy. That can be on public property or private property. That's building seawalls or leaving shorelines. But if you resist, or if a government imposes a seawall on private property, that's going to run afoul of Fifth Amendment takings, which essentially says the government has to provide just compensation for the property that's been taken. If you're a private property owner and you build a seawall, you can also be subject to nuisance flooding if that goes against another property owner that's adjacent. That's just the resistance strategy for adaptation. So there's legal challenges there. The second is accommodation. This can be as simple as saying on this coastal barrier island, you can't build there anymore, or it can be climate regulations or have some kind of building construction standards. But the Fifth Amendment isn't just physical takings, Doug. It's also regulatory takings, which means that if a governmental regulation goes too far, it can be a climate-informed building construction standard or a no-build zone, then that also could implicate the Fifth Amendment, and the government also has to provide a check to the property owner. And there's a famous case out of the Supreme Court called Lucas, which your listeners may want to listen to, which basically said just that, essentially. There's a coastal barrier island in South Carolina. The South Carolina government said you can't build there anymore. And the homeowner sued, saying this is a Fifth Amendment taking, and ultimately settled with South Carolina for several $100,000. That's just the accommodation strategy. The third strategy is retreat or managed retreat, sometimes called community relocation, which I actually like that term. But that's going to be very challenging just to do that at scale for a wide variety of listeners. I know A.R. Siders, who's been in your program, has spoken very eloquently about that, but that there's some price issues associated with that. And of course, if it's mandatory retreat, we simply cannot eminent domain a way out of the climate problem because of the cost prohibition associated with that and just the political pushback you would get from doing so. So our last strategy is our default strategy, which I call it unmanaged retreat, which essentially is sometimes we move, sometimes we rebuild, sometimes we do a little bit in between. That's very ad hoc, it's reactive, it's disjointed, and very inequitable. But that's what we've defaulted to as our default adaptation strategy on a national level. But each one of these 4 different approaches does have legal issues associated with it, which is why the Stanford article does a deep dive into each one.
So I want to pivot to your new paper, and it's called Destroy, Rebuild, Repeat, How to Break the Climate Disaster Cycle. Is this actually officially published yet?
It is not. No, it's available on an academic website called SSRN, and it's still under edits and under review. So if your listeners have ideas or thoughts, I'm taking all suggestions as it goes through the editing process.
Are you going to stick to this title? Because I like this title. It's very subtle. Destroy. Tell us a bit about that. How did you come to that title?
So I was working on the Stanford article, and I realized there's a lot more to say because it's not just adaptation issues associated with climate change and the law, but there's also disaster law issues associated with climate change. And so when I started looking at unmanaged retreat and did a deep dive into unmanaged retreat, it actually became worse as I looked at where people are moving to and how laws are actually designed to not be in conversation with each other. And our default strategy for disaster, I call it destroy, rebuild, repeat, where after an extreme weather event, Homes are destroyed, property is destroyed. Oftentimes we rebuild right in the same exact location where the extreme weather event occurred at taxpayer expense under the Stafford Act and other governmental programs, and then we'll repeat. And so we've seen an uptick, Doug, in repetitive loss properties and in severe repetitive loss properties. So we're actually going the wrong way. And I think governmental policy and governmental statutes and law are playing a role in this destroy, rebuild, repeat crisis.
We're going to get into some of the details of actually how you do it, but just expand. It's part of your title, and I like this, is break the climate disaster cycle. And I mean, what do you really mean?
So my sense is that we have a variety of programs and laws that are on the books, again, designed for an Earth 1.0, not for a climate destabilized 2.0, where we incentivize risk taking, or we don't adequately take into account risk taking, where people are actually disproportionately moving to climate exposed areas. And we have seen an uptick in insurance programs, not just the national flood insurance program, but also state insurance programs, which are essentially subsidizing that risk taking in certain climate exposed areas. And then after disaster strikes, we have a series of laws that really rebuild at all costs. And that's the Stafford Act, which your listeners are likely familiar with. And there's a human desire to help, Doug, which is very understandable, to help people in need after a natural disaster. But what I did a deep dive into was that the payments being made for these repetitive loss properties and severe repetitive loss properties strike me as very much unsustainable. And we need to just have a coherent rethinking of just our disaster laws and policies.
I don't know if you crossed paths, but I did an episode with Rob Moore at NRDC, and we called it Flood, Rebuild, Repeat, just based on some of the work he's done. Obviously, overlap there, but his focus was on flooding specifically. But did you happen to listen to that episode?
I listened to the episode. I love Rob Moore's work, and I may have even quoted him or cited him in the article.
Fantastic. I want to dig into this paper a bit here, and I really love some of the terminology and these phrases that you're using about this. They might be common, and I'm just not as familiar with these things in journal articles and such, but a chapter you have or a section is called Democratizing Climate Risk Information. Can't even pronounce it. How do you do that? And you want that so you can inform and warn individuals effectively. But tell me a bit about that chapter.
Sure, I'd love to do that. So I really think it's important that we democratize climate risk information. I think that humans and the climate psychologists who listen to American Adapts can speak to this more eloquently, but humans are inherently not very good at judging climate risk or really take into account risk for a wide variety of psychological reasons. But it strikes me, at a minimum, government must be willing to provide information and warnings and dismantle barriers to climate risk information. And what strikes me is that very much that's not the case when you were to buy a home, or if you're a renter to looking at renting a home. There's no sort of right to climate information. In fact, the federal law, the Privacy Act, protects detailed flood claims history prior to the most important purchase of your life, which is a home purchase. And many states which govern real estate laws and real estate transaction laws actually don't do a very good job of democratizing or showcasing flood risk or climate risk. My first step in my sort of proposal is the government should really do no harm. And we need to democratize climate information, at least give people the tools to make informed decisions. There are millions and millions of people who are in flood zones who may not even be aware they're disproportionately exposed to climate risk. And laws are playing a role in hiding that risk. It's crazy to me, Doug, that you can buy a used car, and have access to Carfax or a similar type technology and have more information about the damage history, the flood history of that automobile than you would of buying a new home. So the first step, I think, is to really provide this information and warnings to people before they buy a home.
I'm going to probably reference earlier episodes, but I don't know if you listened to that episode I did with Dr. Justin Mankin from Dartmouth. And it's basically a step earlier than all this. It's about climate data and the availability of it. So much is produced by the federal government or state governments, and yet all these private firms are coming online and taking that. And I encourage that, but at the same time, you're not quite sure if they're using it effectively. Did you happen to hear that conversation?
Doug, you should know I listen to all your
I don't know. I just don't want to assume, but yeah. Okay, go on.
all your episodes. I just download it while it's hot. The Justin Macon it's a great episode. Totally, I would co-sign to basically everything that Justin said in his episode. And I think you can do both things, right? It could be a concurrent effort. There's a role, of course. We want private information. We want their technological tools, artificial intelligence to provide better climate risk information. But government should also try to provide better access to information and certainly dismantle barriers to climate risk information. I encourage, I think, both things. We can walk and chew gum at the same time. But I am concerned that for people who can only afford access to this information, they will be having the full picture of climate risk. And for the people who can't afford it, they'll be left in the shadows. And so that's not good for a wide variety of reasons. But at a minimum, we need to start thinking of risk information as almost a fundamental right, particularly when we talk about where you're going to live and where you're going to have your family grow and prosper.
That's where I was arguing. And in a different episode, I had Dr. Spinrad, he's an O administrator, come on, and we were talking about some of this climate data and risk information. And I was arguing, even when you make it available, even planners or even the end user, let's say a homeowner, they don't necessarily even know how to use this information. And so I was encouraging him, and I'm not quite sure if I articulated the proper way, but just there needs to be some training going on there. Even just the middle people here, the planners at the local government level, that this is complex stuff. And so even if you make it available, that's not good enough. And so I think there just needs to be a lot more training and educating people around these things.
Totally agree. And there's to be better implementation. And look, some of this information is, I read it, I find it very interesting, but it needs to be accessible, right, to all people and understood and actionable, right? What does this mean for the right context? I will say as a legal matter, this first proposal of democratizing climate risk information could play a role in what I mentioned earlier of regulatory takings. One of the key components of a regulatory takings challenge is if, in fact, a government was to impose some sort of new climate-informed regulation, it can be a building construction standard, then if the homeowner already knows that they're in a flood zone or in a zone that is going to be exposed to climate risk, the government can argue that there's a reasonable investment-backed expectation, which is one of a Supreme Court cases which addresses the scope of regulatory takings, and that the homeowner should have known that there could be forthcoming regulations or forthcoming climate-informed regulatory action that the government is taking, and essentially having access to this climate risk information could serve as a legal shield for forthcoming governmental action.
When I was reviewing for this, I had so many quotes, and I'm using my quotes when I ask you these questions. I just want to quote you here. And this is in regards to people moving to at-risk areas today. They still are doing this. And so you say, people appear to be choosing immediate benefits, housing affordability, sunshine, and lower taxes over long-term climate risk and exposure. I get it, but that's the rub of this issue. How do we stop that?
Well, first, obviously, there's an information component. I talk later about the second step, of course, which is not just inform and warn, but retreat or suspension of certain laws or certain governmental services. But you're exactly right. People are choosing sunshine and the sort of immediate benefits and low taxes. Florida and Texas have seen massive in-state migration, particularly after COVID-19 crisis. But there are governmental programs in place that I think are providing a moral hazard, one being the National Flood Insurance Program, also Citizens in Florida, which is the state-based insurance program, which is filling the void as private insurers leave. But you're exactly right. I call it the YOLO climate problem. You only live once. Let's have fun and use the immediate benefits of sunshine, low taxes, fill in the blank. But it's not a wise long-term planning strategy.
I'm from Florida. You probably know as well if you listen to my episodes. And yeah, they're just saying, come here, please keep moving here. And it's just completely irresponsible. And correct me if I'm wrong. And maybe this is just not your comfort zone. But in the paper, like one of the strategies or recommendations I have is like, it's not that easy to change laws. It's not even necessarily that easy to change policies. But leaders can communicate. They can create awareness. And I don't think that's necessarily a recommendation you have in there. There should be people out there saying this is not wise, even though there's all these things that are currently encouraging you to come here. There's this huge climate risk. And there's not a lot of politicians and anyone really saying that out loud in a way where it could potentially discourage people from coming to these areas. And I know that's fraught with risk itself, but that kind of basic communication, I think, is going to be the next 5-10 years because all these changes to laws are going to take a long time.
You're exactly right. And as I dove into this, and I'm not a demographer, But there is a climate trifecta, and it's all about incentives, Doug, in terms of how leaders, real estate developers, and homeowners approach climate risk and the climate problem. And the incentives just aren't there to say, stay away, don't come here. If you're a real estate developer, of course, there's money to be made and selling sort of the sunshine and the access to the beach in an area that maybe looks great on Zillow. If you're a municipality, you're really worried about your municipal property tax base, and telling people not to come is going to hurt your schools, hurt your roads, hurts all the infrastructure you have in place. And of course, if you're an existing homeowner, you want to live in a thriving community. You want your property to grow and value. And so there's this odd trifecta of interest, both real estate developers, municipalities, and existing homeowners, which are not doing the messaging that you are providing. So I agree with you that law I think it's all the above type approach. We just acknowledge it's going to be a very challenging problem.
One of your sections here too, I love this language here, and that's why I'm not an elected official, and I could say I love this. And tell me about halting government services. This is a step that would obviously be required once we start thinking about managed retreat in a big way, and maybe even talk about, and I'm going to mention the case that I guess these groups justify as DeShaney versus Winnebago County Department of Social Services as a sort of a justification of halting those government services. But what does that mean? What does that look like?
Sure. And I'm happy to talk about that. Maybe it's going to help your listeners out. I propose a 3-way framework. And let me just say that this is tough medicine. There's no free lunch when it comes to climate change. And I think my job as a scholar is to not necessarily advocate for some kind of political belief, but provides a legal framework to think about possible solutions. And so my first proposal, of course, is democratize climate risk information. The second is we should move away from unmanaged retreat and exist in and favor voluntary buyouts, particularly in areas that are really vulnerable to climate change. But I also acknowledge there's certain areas after we do those first two, the buyouts and democratizing climate information, they will stay in place. So what are some legal issues associated with the suspension potentially of governmental programs? And it's really interesting. And I basically talk about 4 different suspension ideas that are being floated out there. And some communities have actually turned to this already. So I think we should understand the legal implications of doing so. The first is, of course, suspension of governmental programs, such as the National Flood Insurance Program, which creates a classic moral hazard. Suspension of emergency services, which implicates the duty to rescue. That's the DeShaney case, Doug, that you're referring to. Legally, your listeners may or may not know this, but if a state government is aware of underlying danger and refuses to act, there is no affirmative duty to come to the aid of its citizens. This is from the case DeShaney from 1989. It's been heavily criticized because the facts of that case are very horrific. But essentially, the duty to rescue is quite limited under the common law. There is an important exception to that, Doug, which I think is really important for climate change, which is if the government has created the inherent danger, then there is an affirmative duty to rescue. And that's exactly what the litigants argued in the children's case out of Oregon, the Juliana lawsuit, which your listeners may be familiar with, which the lawyers basically said, look, the government knew that climate change is a harm. It played a role in causing this underlying danger. It acted with deliberate indifference, and this caused climate impacts and climate harm, which are actionable. So this duty to rescue, and in my context in the paper, I talk about potentially suspending emergency services, has to wrestle with both the outer scope of the duty to rescue and whether or not the government has created the underlying danger.
Yeah, and I found that fascinating. This was me getting the weeds in the DeShaney case, is that it is unusual in that it was a child endangerment case. And so if that would be odd that we create these climate change policies based on this original child endangerment. And you also acknowledge that might actually be underlined, and correct me if I'm wrong, because on the flip side, the government's kind of contradicting itself because it allows fossil fuel extraction on federal land. And so somehow it's encouraging this behavior that could endanger people in the context. Did I get that right?
You got it right. And let me just say the DeShaney case is a really hard case to read. And you're exactly right that the facts are completely different from the context of climate change, but it does provide the common law basis for this duty to rescue. I think what's interesting with this danger creation is that the government has already said that greenhouse gas emissions cause harm to human health. That was the EPA's endangerment finding from 2009. So the government's already been on the record that there's an endangerment component to this. And of course, the U.S. is pumping out a lot of fossil fuels, and the U.S. has a lot of the government has a lot of federal lands and continental shelf land, which is open to drilling. So I think this is an unresolved legal issue, the exact scope of this. But I think it's something to think about, particularly as state and localities are thinking about maybe suspending emergency services to protect the emergency first responders.
Relevant to emergency responders, in your paper, you talk about the threat to these emergency responders as they're responding to these disasters. That should weigh in if a community should rebuild. Did I get that?
I think that's right. I think that we're so much focused on saving homeowners once extreme weather happens or climate disaster happens, would be flood, hurricane, fill in the blank, wildfire. I also think that the emergency first responders are increasingly stressed. You can look at the real cost to their physical injury to include death, whether it be National Guard, police, EMT, law enforcement, the people who are responding to these disasters. And it strikes me that has to be part of the calculation. California wildfires, in one event, there were 6 firefighters who tragically lost their lives. And I think that we need to start thinking about, should we be building in certain areas which are going to be exposed to climate disaster, which risk the lives not only of the homeowner or renter, but also the people responding to the underlying disaster, because the human cost is really, really important, regardless of you're the homeowner or the emergency first responder.
Listen, I'm in complete agreement about the logic of that, but my goodness, I just don't. That will be a stretch for people to actually prioritize the safety of these responders in the context of where they're going to still live and rebuild. I think it's going to be human nature, but I agree. I disagree. So we've dug into this paper quite a bit, but I do want to make sure that it's the whole overall message of what you're trying to do here. And that's what I want to pivot to now. And so you're proposing an entirely new framework to break this cycle of destroy, rebuild, repeat. Let's talk about this. So I want that we're going to be threading all these things that we just been talking about. So what is this framework?
So I have a 3-part framework. I love 3s. First is, of course, inform and warn, provide an information that provides some statutory work, reforming the Privacy Act. I'm encouraged by many states which are providing better flood information prior to a home's closure. New York, New Jersey, South Carolina, North Carolina are all looking towards this, but many coastal states are not. Florida, my home state of Georgia, does not have in place. So my first step is we need to inform and warn people about the underlying climate risk. The second, of course, is retreat. And obviously, this should happen sequentially, but that's my perfect illegal academic view of this. Life is messy, right? So this may be happening concurrently. And we need to move away from unmanaged retreat to more community relocation and managed retreat. I just acknowledge, Doug, that this is expensive. I think there's 3 federal managed retreat projects going on now with Native American tribes in Alaska and Washington State. Relatively small Native American tribes, $25 million per tribe. So to do this at scale, when the coastal exposure to flood and other disasters is in the trillions of dollars, just strikes me as unworkable. But there's going to be work to be done for more voluntary buyouts. As part of retreat, I also think that we need to start thinking about more pre-disaster hazard mitigation. And so there's some laws that can be reformed or built upon, one being the Disaster Relief Recovery Act, which amended the Stafford Act, which can provide more pre-disaster work prior to disaster striking. And my last exact proposal is suspension, as we talked about with suspension of emergency services, but also includes potentially suspension or maintenance of coastal roads or repair of coastal roads or roads going to homes in the climate zone, or the suspension of public utility services, which implicates what's called the duty to serve. And again, all of this is really hard. And I'm not suggesting that we should do this now in any one community, but I think I want to start providing the framework when these hard choices be made. What are the legal issues associated with each one? And it's not easy. If we were to do, for example, suspend public utility services, that would immediately have litigation. So we should understand the left and right limits of these policy options.
You didn't mention it, but you did in the paper, and I've talked about it on the podcast before, is that community in Louisiana, is it Isle de Charles?
Exactly. Yep, exactly.
As you made that point, these are just not great examples in regards to the scale. Think about just Miami versus these tiny communities and how expensive it is. And so that disconnect from learning lessons from these smaller communities to that larger managed retreat efforts that are going to be required. I do think all these things that you explain in this paper offer a pathway, but these small examples, I'm like, people are just going to look, that was 200 people. That's not relevant to what we're doing here.
You're exactly right. And these are, again, this is really hard. But I do think our current strategy is exactly that, is destroy, rebuild, repeat, as unmanaged retreat, fill in the blank on what you want to look at. And so there's real costs, I think, of not being proactive when in approaching these issues.
I'm going to put you on the spot here. You just explained it, and that all made sense to me, but I'm always about developing that elevator pitch, so that's elevator speech to explain these concepts. Because I think what you've suggested here, or you've written here, is just really important. If you're sitting there on the bus explaining what this paper was all about, how would you describe it in a really easy, digestible way?
So I would say that we don't have a current national adaptation strategy or climate disaster strategy. We have laws, policies in place that are ad hoc, inequitable, and reactive. We should be proactive. We should think holistically about what Earth 2.0 looks like. And that means we should start thinking about existing laws and doctrines that may have worked in the past, but just are going to be unfeasible and, frankly, fiscally unsustainable for the future. So let's get to work now on finding the solutions that work best for your community.
That'll work. I think they'll look at you funny, but they sit still. I think that, okay, I see what he's saying here. So
we got a lot of funny looks, Doug. That's okay.
That's right. And I don't think this is necessarily the point that you were trying to make. My question here is just, what did you mean in the paper when it's simply impossible to eminent domain our way out of the climate crisis? I don't think that was the point you were making about eminent domain earlier in this conversation, though, were you?
No, I think that eminent domain could be a possible tool. It certainly has been used in the past. And that's the very last step on the very last part of the paper when all else fails. But that's fraught for not just the Fifth Amendment piece where you have to provide just compensation, but also just a political blowback associated with eminent domain that would be part of the conversation. And of course, the United States has a very dark history of eminent domaining certain peoples out of areas and forced movement that I think we just need to be very sensitive to. But it is a possible tool. I think it's very last resort.
Yeah, and we talked about it in our previous conversation on that episode. And then I had Margaret Peloso on, who wrote a book about the law and sea level rise. And we talked a lot about eminent. Again, because I don't have to make these decisions, I get excited about these tools that seem like they're blunt force instruments that'll just get you through there. But like you said, that's fraught with danger. But at some point, people are going to be forced to make these decisions when they're not necessarily doing the responsible things in advance.
That's right. As a human psychologist, environmental psychologist, have a lot to say about that. By the way, I'm looking right now at Margaret Peloso's outstanding book, Adapting to Rising Sea Levels, Legal Challenges and Opportunities. So there's also opportunities. This is very kind of dark stuff sometimes, but I'm a rational optimist, so it's important to focus on that as well.
I love it. Okay. I like to do hypotheticals on this podcast, and especially talking to lawyers. You got tenure. You can do it, say anything you want now. We're all good. So
within reason.
I know. Okay. So in your paper, again, I got another quote here. Many people fleeing from hazard zones are moving to places that are more vulnerable to climate change. And we already acknowledged that. When I read that, and I know this, and I talk about Florida, there's got to be some consequence to this. And I think of today, if someone moves to Florida today, there's so much information out there saying how at risk. And I think people in the climate space were constantly making excuses for everyone out. Oh, there's not enough awareness. They just don't know. But in other areas of society, we make people take responsibility for their actions. And because people will keep moving to these areas for years. And so there's got to be something retroactively where people are going to be held responsible. I don't know if it's where insurance kind of steps in or you're going to be eligible for buyout programs. But I guess my question to you is just we've got to hold people responsible even today for decisions that are going to be happening in the next few years, because we won't ever be able to afford this, because 10 years from now, we'll buy you out too, even though you had 10 years of climate awareness building that's been out there.
I agree with that. And I call in this paper there's an adaptation disaster disconnect. In other words, in the law, we call ex ante, or prior to disaster striking, we have adaptation land use policies, which just are not in conversation with ex post or after disaster strikes laws and policies. And the classic example of this is the National Flood Insurance Program and the Stafford Act, right? So the National Flood Insurance Program is essentially a massive program to subsidize sandcastles that is in place. It's a classic moral hazard where the people who are benefiting from the program are not fully invested in all the risks associated with it. It's heavily subsidized. And then the Stafford Act, which there are some provisions in NFIP or the flood insurance program, which conditions payouts after disaster or flood risk based upon land use policies and other sort of places that should be put in effect by the local government. But the Stafford Act essentially is more of a blank check that where FEMA money flows following disaster. So this is why we're in this cycle, Doug, of destroy, rebuild, repeat. And I think that at a minimum, we need to stop subsidizing these sandcastles in Florida and elsewhere.
Mark, last question related to the article. And so on the duty to repair and maintain, there seems to be a paradox whereby state and local governments may have more legal liabilities for taking proactive climate adaptation measures. What do you mean by the adaptation paradox?
So this is a really important idea, Doug, which may surprise some of your listeners. You remember the discussion before about there's no affirmative duty to come to the aid of a person following the Supreme Court's case in DeShaney. The adaptation paradox, or my colleague, Professor Dan Farber, calls it the adaptation dilemma. We're essentially preparing for climate disaster, taking proactive climate adaptation measures can be legally disadvantaged. And what do I mean by that? Or legally disfavored. So if you were to do nothing, if you were a government and you were to allow an extreme weather event to hit, of course, you have Stafford Act and other provisions that are in place, but you are not on the hook legally for failure to upkeep a levee or any sort of seawall that may have failed throughout the extreme weather event. The extreme weather event is just an act of God, and the federal programs would come into place, and you do your best to repair. But the state and local government would not be on the hook for any sort of adaptation measure. Conversely, there could be a legal liability, a potential for liability, if the levee breached, and if the levee failed to protect a community, or if there was nuisance flooding to a neighboring property, the government would actually have some sort of legal liability. This is due to a case the Supreme Court decided about 10 years ago, which addressed this idea of temporary taking. So if the water was to divert to a nearby property, or the levee broke, there was a question about whether or not the seawall or a levee was adequately maintained, the government may face a litigation. And oddly, this litigation cost, this legal liability of climate litigation, favors, frankly, inaction, which I think is really problematic. And I think the common law, the doctrine, just realize that these are really tough choices that governments are making prior to disaster striking. And there should be a little bit more understanding that the government might be trying to help out the community and should not be exposed to the full menu of all the climate risk associated.
I encourage my listeners that we'll have a link to the paper in its current form. And as Mark said earlier, he's looking for feedback, and you can weigh in on all these issues. And so that's a great opportunity. So Mark, I just have a few more questions. This is related to the paper, and I think the points that you're trying to make about government and the responsibilities and how challenging it is. And you've heard me talk about this before, and this is basically semantics. And so there's the words adaptation and there's resilience. And I've favored adaptation for a long time. That's how I got started. And resilience has been the language I think picked up by government. And I think that's part of the problem, because many of the recommendations that you talk about, these radical changes needed, but then when the government uses language like resilience, I know there's a million definitions of resilience, but it gives the impression that you can climate proof your way out of all of these problems. Adaptation doesn't mean that, or at least it's not supposed to mean that, how most people use it. You hear about these communities hiring a chief resilience officer on the coastline. And I'm glad. I think that's an encouraging sign, but I think they should be called chief adaptation officers. As a lawyer, from the semantics point of view, the government, I think, is giving this false sense of security by using that language of resilience. And I know it's semantics, but any thoughts on that?
That's interesting. I know the national government has the U.S. Climate Resilience Framework, not a national adaptation. I just think that resilience is less controversial, right? It's normatively, everyone wants to be resilient, right? You want to bounce back. So there's a certain saliency with that word that we, I think, individualize and concretize for our individual actions. But adaptation, I think, is more fuller and frankly, maybe a little more honest. Because in my adaptation proposal, I have resistance, accommodation, retreat, unmanaged retreat. All of those things, there's a resilient component to all of them, but they are all tough. They're all tough to do. And yeah, maybe I'm 51% adaptation, Doug.
All right, good. I mean, just some coastal communities, there is no future of resilience. There is no bouncing back. They will be submerged by the sea level, right? It's so
Right.
a lot, again, it's semantics, but I've been a big proponent of the word adaptation for a long time. And there's a million definitions for resilience. And now we're getting people talking about personal resilience in the context of climate resilience. And it's just confusing as heck. But I liked your answer, 51%. I'll take it. And Mark, professionally, like adaptation, I'm sure you're connecting with people out there and who are informing your work. Any sort of those folks professionally that you could tell us who you're working with?
So I love Susan Crawford's work, who wrote the wonderful book on Charleston that is really important work. I think Dan Farber, the work he does at Berkeley, Robin Craig, who just moved to Kansas, is really terrific as it applies to climate adaptation. Yeah, so those are the three sort of lawyers that come to mind. My co-author, his name is Mike Pappas. He's out of University of Colorado. We just wrote a separate paper that came out last month in the Georgia Law Review, just looking at these state insurance agencies, which are playing a bigger role in climate adaptation. The FAIR program in California, Louisiana has a state insurance program, and Florida has Citizens. So Mike Pappas and I did a deep dive into these state insurance programs, analyzing each one. I think that's going to be a really more important issue as insurance and private insurance markets flee, and there'll be pressure on public markets to fill the void.
Yeah, Susan Crawford, I subscribe to her newsletter, and I tell you what, that thing is dense, but I have learned so much. I'm like, so that's how that works. It's really quite remarkable. Okay, last question. And if you could recommend someone that you think should come on the podcast, who should they be?
So I will just speak to my lovely university. And obviously I just got tenure here at Emory, so I'm feeling all the love towards Emory University, which is a great university here in Atlanta, Georgia. But Ajabadi, who is an environmental professor in the College of Arts and Sciences, really innovative work on climate justice, environmental justice, adaptation. She's a relatively recent faculty member here at Emory. And coming in this fall is Stacey Ann Robinson, who is another wonderful academic focusing on adaptation as it applies to small island developing states, particularly the Pacific and the Caribbean. Both would be great guests for you, Doug, and I'm happy to make introductions.
All right. Fantastic. A lot of great names there. Mark, it's always pleasure. I love having lawyers come on, especially ones who just got their tenure and talk about these issues. I like hypotheticals and I like the work that you're doing, and you're always welcome on the podcast.
Thanks, Doug. Great to be here.
Okay, adapters, that is a wrap. Thanks to Mark for coming on the podcast. It's always a treat to chat with Mark. He's really offering some great legal analysis of the tough decisions we're all going to have to make as we adapt to climate change. I highly recommend you take a look at his paper. A link is in my show notes. It's very readable and it gets to the nuts and bolts on decisions we'll have to make in reforming our legal code for adaptation. What does it mean to do managed retreat? Well, Mark identifies many of the land use decisions involved with that and the reform we'll need to undertake. Definitely check out Mark's previous episode on America Adapts. That too is in the show notes. Okay, this episode's hot take. And for those of you who aren't familiar and haven't heard me do one in a previous episode, a hot take is a controversial opinion that has no factually right or wrong answer. It's a knee-jerk response to an issue. So here we go. I actually just recorded this episode not too long ago, and a few days after the recording, the Supreme Court ruled in what has been known as the Chevron deference case. It basically overturned 40 years of precedent and will make it increasingly difficult for federal agencies to regulate things like the environment. And that means it could undercut their ability to set adaptation policies. The court case turns many of the science-based decisions over to individual courts that the federal agencies used to do. Obviously, it will take some time to figure out what it really means, but in all likelihood, it's bad news for federal-level adaptation planning. Okay, so here's my hot take. The climate is warming. We have to adapt. No matter how ridiculous the politics get in the short term, the warming is like gravity. You can't fight it. And we will adapt, kicking and screaming if needed. And that will require a more stable regulatory environment. So I could see in the not too distant future, Congress passing some sort of climate adaptation amendment to the U.S. Constitution that empowers the federal government to take action, even dramatic action when needed, and take some of these decisions out of the petty politics we now see. Listen, this is a hot take. It doesn't mean I think it's really going to happen, just something to ponder. Let me hear from you and your hot take around this issue. Okay, adapters, imagine the potential of showcasing your achievement through a widely acclaimed podcast that boasts a large network of climate and adaptation professionals. Yes, I'm talking about America Adapts. and how it offers your company or organization the perfect platform to tell your adaptation story and spread your message to a diverse and highly influential audience of climate professionals. By sponsoring a whole episode, you not only have the chance to share your story with the world, but also integrate a podcast episode into your organization's long-term communication strategy. It's time to expand beyond the confines of webinars and white papers, which can be dry and forgettable. Let's work together closely to identify the experts who best represent the remarkable work your organization is undertaking in adaptation through the power of podcast storytelling. This will not only enable effective communication with your members, board members, and funders, but also leave a lasting impact. The value of podcasts lies in their ability to continue promoting your story long after the initial release, ensuring it remains a critical educational resource for years to come. I am humbled to have collaborated with such prestigious partners as Battelle, the U.S. Department of Defense, Natural Resources Defense Council, the University of Pennsylvania at Wharton, World Wildlife Fund, UCLA, Harvard Universities, the Trustees of Reservation, and more. So let's add your organization to this esteemed list. Yes, we can make a significant difference in the world of climate change adaptation. To learn more about the enduring value of podcasts and how they can benefit your company or organization, email me at americaadapts@gmail.com. Okay, adapters, keep up the great work. I'll see you next time.